But Kate Checks, you're joining us here representing Hollywood Inc.
I am.
How are you? Are you doing well?
I'm great. How are you, Adam Ray?
I'm doing really well, thank you. The thing is, though, your CEO, she left, like, this is obnoxious.
It's a little wild.
Excessive. Is there
it's a little
way-
excessive.
Do you have the authority to kind of make a change?
I don't know.
here?
Ricky Hollywood may be mad, but you know what? It's corporate
If
America.
you could,
so
yes.
let's do it. We're going to switch this out, get it out, and we will put this lovely Patriots helmet down instead, so we can show off all the goods throughout the season.
Well, we appreciate you doing that. All right, put the photo down. Now, the thing is, we're starting week. There it is. The Patriots helmet is there adorning the table, I should say. And we get ready now for week 12. Of course, that is there because Team Hollywood Inc. had the highest score last week. But one of the most significant victories last week came from me beating Team AEW. Cody Rhodes and I had a little bit of a wager. He's going to have to wear some white Adidas the next time he's on AEW. But I sent them a message this week. Let's check it out. Cody and Brady, we're not so different, you and me. Of course, I can still compete for championships. You can't, but that's okay. And this week, you gave me a stellar battle. I wanted to give you a little round of applause. I appreciate the effort, but this is exactly what happens. You know what? This is what happens when you step into my ring. And you might think to yourself, this Mark standing before you is going to go and gather his inner circle and drink some cheap champagne. But you know what? That's not what I'm going to do, because you know what? I've got my eyes on the horizon. I have got a bigger prize in mind, and that is the Fantasy League One Championship that I will be wearing around my waist. Let's take a look at the matchups for League One. The Purpose Chasers against Kane Brown, Team AEW and the Oracle, FaZe Clan, and Charles Melton. Hollywood Inc., Rank and File, MG Unit, TaylorMade, the B Team, and the Fantasy Footballers. And let's stay right there. The Fantasy Footballers currently have the number 2 seed in the Experts division. But he's got to play Graham Barfield, who can get back into the race. A pivotal matchup, I think, are the running backs that we're going to be looking at here. As you look at their rosters, Graham holding tight at 5 and 6.
Yeah.
He's still in the mix. I think he's technically.
After a slow start, he's bounced back.
He's got a solid
Wasn't he
team.
0 and 5?
0 and 4.
0 and 4. Okay,
Yeah.
And the biggest part of that is going to be the running back position. And I know Tevin Coleman is somebody that Graham is going to be starting this week. Marcus, how do you feel that he's going to do this week?
I think Tevin Coleman's in a good spot this week. I know we've said that before and it hasn't really worked out, but I feel like this week he's in a good spot. The Packer run defense is one of the lower-ranked run defenses in the National Football League. Plus, we're still trying to figure out who exactly is going to be available for the 49ers. Will Matt Breida be there? What's the status for Emmanuel Sanders, George Kittle? So they could be missing some pieces, which means Jimmy Garoppolo could have to lean on Tevin Coleman a little bit more this week.
Yeah. And the Fantasy Footballers are going to be leaning on Chris Carson. How do you like them in this matchup?
So Chris Carson, I think, is a really good option, and he's been a continually good running back this season for fantasy, averaging almost 16 points a game and 22 touches a game, which is great. And though they're going up against the Eagles and their defense, which I think notoriously are pretty darn good, and we're defense that was picked up early on in a lot of fantasy rosters, they've not been so great against running backs. So I do think Chris Carson is a great option, and when you have Russell Wilson as your quarterback, you should feel pretty secure that you're going to get the ball and be able to ball out.
I would almost even say that the Seattle Seahawks are a little bit matchup proof. And speaking of other matchups, you two over here have got a pivotal game here too. I know the tensions are running high on the set. Let's take a look at the rosters there. The quarterbacks, Matt Ryan, who MG besmirched when he drafted him, going up against Derek Carr, who I'm assuming that you gave up on Jared Goff.
I did. He had one too many disappointing games that I just had to cut ties. I didn't get rid of him, but he's on my bench. He's
you put him on the bench.
Going to stay on the bench for quite some time.
The only team that I have lost to this season was Week 1 against Hollywood. Listen, I was going to be benevolent this week, and I thought about not picking up a tight end. I put in a waiver claim on Jacob Hollister, and I was of the mind that if I didn't get him, I'm like, well, then forget it. I'm not going to waste anything else or anything like that. But if I'm looking at this game, one of the more interesting plays that you have for this week, Golden Tate. How do you feel about him?
I feel pretty good about Golden Tate. I know the Bears' defense is really strong, and I think there's a lot more expectation for them going into the season. But Golden Tate can hold his own after he came back from suspension for the Giants. He's had 80-plus receiving yards and 6-plus receptions in the last 4 out of 5 games. So I think he's finally getting in the rhythm and feeling good with Daniel Jones as QB, and I think Chicago will give him a run for his money, but he's a solid wide receiver option, especially with other options on a bye.
That was one of the great things that Ricky Hollywood did with her draft this year, is drafting Dak Prescott as her quarterback too, drafting Golden Tate knowing it was going to take a couple weeks for him to get going. And now, one of the players who I'm starting this week is Calvin Ridley. I've got a pretty good stable of wide receivers, but I think this matchup against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers is a must start for Calvin Ridley. The Buccaneers, of course, have allowed the most fantasy points to receivers this season. So without hesitation, I'm putting him in my lineup. I do have DJ Moore in the mix too. I might end up starting him over Cooper Kupp, but now that the Rams are getting all the receivers back, like Brandon Cooks and Robert Woods, that means it should help open things up for Cooper Kupp once again. Now, the next match we're going to be looking at, FaZe Clan versus Charles Melton and the Meltonites. And Charles, you know what? I understand he's 2-10, and I know that he's going to be making that switch at quarterback, but he has such a good roster. And I think that if you walked out of a draft this year and you're like, I got Le'Veon Bell, I got Odell Beckham Jr., I'm feeling pretty good. He's had some other nice spots too. But looking at that, and I think the quarterback he ended up putting in was Baker Mayfield.
Baker Mayfield.
How do you feel? Now we know how I feel about it.
I know how you feel. I'm kind of scared to say it after you're open.
Say what you got to say.
My goodness. His points have increased in the last 3 games. Obviously, the Browns have just been a little bit of a disappointment this year after all the hype that they had coming into this season. But he's got a tremendously favorable matchup against the Dolphins. They're allowing 25 fantasy points per game to quarterbacks. That's the 5th most in the NFL. You know that Baker's in a situation where they want to come back, especially after what's gone on this past week with their team and Myles Garrett. He's going to be in a situation where he's want to prove himself. OBJ is going to be on the field. Jarvis Landry is going to be on the field. I have a feeling that Baker is going to perform well.
The Browns won on Thursday night, but it felt like they lost, so I agree with you. But Kimmy, let's talk about Tom Brady.
Yes. Tom Brady, I mean, you guys saw the Patriots banner and the Patriots helmet on the table, so obviously Ricky Hollywood and Hollywood Inc. is fired up about Tom Brady, but he is a must-start this week going up against the Cowboys. I think Tom Brady has never really been a top fantasy quarterback, but when you look at this matchup, this is some matchup where you want to have him on your roster. The Cowboys have allowed 23-plus fantasy points since week 10 to quarterbacks, and they have allowed 2 top 10 quarterbacks in the last 2 weeks, including Jeff Driscoll, who was Matthew Stafford's backup QB. So if you're Tom Brady and you're that elite of a quarterback going up against a defense that's not so hot against quarterbacks, it's kind of like a no-brainer.
And I like James White as well in that game, too, because they're giving up a lot of fantasy points to running backs who can catch the ball out of the backfield. Let's look at the purpose chasers. Desi Banks, Kane Brown.
Ooh, 2-2-9.
Couple of teams that are scuffling along. Of course, Kane Brown will be making some changes to his lineup. He's slow playing it, not letting Desi know what he's going to do. But, Taylor, what do you think about Todd Gurley?
I like Gurley. Obviously, he had 28 touches last week, which was a career high for him. And I only see his load. I don't think they're going to be using load management on him going forward. They're in a situation where they need to win. They need to win out in order to make it to the playoffs. The whole team knows that. They're going to be using Gurley. They're not going to be trying to hold him back and kind of preserve him. They're going to put him out there. He's going to get a lot of touches. I feel good about it. They are going up against the Ravens, which is one of the strongest run defenses.
Well, you know, and on the other side, too, Phillip Lindsay's got a tough matchup going up against the Buffalo Bills. I think that's what's the most interesting part about this is that both of these running backs have shown flashes at certain points this season that they've got it. But again, these are tough matchups. I agree with you. I think that Todd Gurley would have the advantage of this one. All right, one other matchup to look over. Team Oracle going up against Team AEW. Oracle has been leading the celebrity division, if not for the entire season. It feels like the entire season. And she's done it despite not getting great production out of Saquon Barkley. Does that change this week against the Chicago Bears, Marcus?
I think it does, actually. I mean, the Bears' run defense has not been great, especially once they lost to Akeem Hicks.
Yeah.
It's really opened some things up for people there. And you look, I know you've seen some tape recently of Barkley saying that he's watched himself and saying that he hasn't been the player he thinks he can be. So he wants to kind of refocus and get back to the kind of production he has. He hasn't had a ton of big plays, which was a staple of his season last year. I think there's some opportunity for him to really make some big plays, especially if they can get him the ball out in space. So I think you see the Saquon Barkley that we were used to seeing last year.
Alvin Kamara
returned from injury, looks like the guy who was the stud at the beginning of the season. Can we expect him to have another monster game this week?
I think he's absolutely going to have another monster game. He is a top 5 fantasy running back, and when you see what the Saints are doing on the offensive side of the ball, they're in really good rhythm, and they're at home in the Superdome against the Panthers. And I know that some people were kind of skeptical on what Kamara would look like post-injury, especially with Latavius Murray coming in and stepping up and getting such a heavy load, but I do not think any fantasy owners should worry. Alvin Kamara is going to be, I think, a top 3 running back this week when you look at the matchups. And he's healthy and he's feeling good, so I'm pumped up about it.
And an interesting note, those were the first 2 running backs selected in the draft, of course. Candace and Brady Rhodes. They lasted the longest with the hula hoops.
Yeah.
So.